When school boards struggle, it's often not because members lack passion or commitment. It's because the board has drifted from its governance role. According to the National School Boards Association, one of the essential keywords of effective boards is policy. Policy is how a board translates vision into direction. It's how values become expectation. It's how governance becomes real. In this video, we're going deeper than approve the policy manual. We're going to examine what the policy tenet truly is, why it's critical to student success and system stability, and how boards can do it well, especially when the pressure is high. At its core, policy is the board's primary governing tool. Policy defines a district's values and expectations. It sets guardrails for operations. It establishes accountability, and it clarifies roles between the board and the superintendent. Policy is not about daily management. It's not about solving individual complaints. It's not about reacting to headlines. Policy answers three big governance questions. What do we believe? What do we expect? And how will we hold the system accountable? For example, when a board adopts a student discipline policy, it is not writing a suspension letter. It is defining principles: fairness, safety, due process, equity. The superintendent then develops procedures aligned to that policy. Similarly, a budget policy does not decide which vendor gets a contract. It sets expectations for fiscal responsibility, transparency, balanced budgeting, and financial oversight. In short, policy is the board's way of governing at the 30,000-foot level, not operating at ground level. Policy provides three critical functions: stability, clarity, and protection. Policy creates stability. Leadership changes, board members rotate, superintendents transition. Policy ensures that the district's direction does not shift dramatically with every election cycle. For example, consider a board that adopts a long-term literacy policy committing to evidence-based reading instruction aligned with the science of reading. That policy anchors the district's academic direction, even if personnel changes. Without strong policy, direction can become personality-driven instead of mission-driven. Policy provides role clarity. One of the most common governance failures is micromanagement. Imagine a board member receiving a parent complaint about a bus driver. Without clear policy boundaries, that board member might call the transportation director directly. That undermines the superintendent and creates confusion. But if policy clearly states that the board governs through policy, the superintendent manages operations, or complaints follow an established chain of command, then everyone understands their lane. Strong policy prevents conflict before it begins. And finally, policy protects the district. In times of controversy, policy becomes the board's strongest defense. Consider real-world examples like social media conduct issues, student privacy concerns, curriculum disputes, or public record requests. When a board can say, "We followed board policy," it demonstrates fairness, consistency, and legal compliance. Policy isn't just governance, it's risk management. Now let's go deeper. Effective boards don't just adopt policies, they govern through them. So to do policy well, boards need to align policy to vision and goals. Policy should not exist in isolation. If the board's strategic goal is improving third grade reading proficiency, policy should prioritize early literacy, require data reporting, and set accountability expectations. If policy and strategic goals are disconnected, governance becomes fragmented. Ask regularly, does our policy framework reinforce our strategic priorities? 2, boards need to focus on what, not how. Strong policy defines outcomes and expectations, not procedures. For example, a weak policy. Teachers must submit lesson plans every Friday by 3 p.m. Strong policy. The superintendent shall ensure consistent instructional planning aligned to district curriculum standards. The first example micromanages. The second governs. A helpful test. If it reads like an employee handbook detail, it probably belongs in administrative procedure, not board policy. 3. Boards must review and update policy regularly. Outdated policy creates confusion and liability. For example, technology policies written before one-on-one devices, social media policies written before modern platforms, remote learning gaps exposed during COVID-19. High-functioning boards establish a policy review cycle, ensuring policies remain current, legally compliant, and aligned with district direction. Number 4, boards need to use policy to guide difficult decisions. In emotionally charged situations, strong boards must return to policy. Imagine a heated public meeting about a controversial book. Rather than debating the book's content publicly, the board can rely on established instructional materials policy, review procedures, and criteria for selection and reconsideration. This keeps the discussion grounded in governance rather than opinion. Policy becomes the anchor in turbulent waters. And finally, boards should evaluate through policy. Policy should inform your superintendent evaluation. If policy sets expectations for financial oversight, student achievement reporting, safe school environments, etc., then the superintendent evaluation should measure performance against those expectations. Otherwise, policy becomes symbolic rather than functional. Even strong boards can drift when it comes to policy governance. The warning signs are often subtle, but the consequences can be significant. Reactionary policymaking. One of the most common pitfalls is writing policy in response to a single incident. For example, imagine a situation where a student misuses a device inappropriately. In response, a board drafts a highly restrictive technology policy limiting access for all students. The intent may be to solve the problem quickly, but reactionary policy often creates broader limitations than necessary and can unintentionally hinder good instruction. Good governance requires stepping back and asking, is this an isolated issue that procedures can address, or does it represent a systematic concern that warrants policy change? Policy should be principle-driven, not pressure-driven. Micromanaging through policy. Another common mistake is writing policy that dictates operational details. For instance, specifying exact timelines for staff meeting schedules or approval processes for minor purchases. When policy becomes overly prescriptive, it restricts administrative flexibility and weakens the superintendent's ability to lead effectively. Strong policy defines outcomes and guardrails, not step-by-step instructions. Ignoring policy when it becomes inconvenient. Sometimes boards adopt strong policies, but abandon them when pressure rises. Consider a controversial personnel matter. If policy outlines a clear complaint process, but the board bypasses it due to community pressure, that inconsistency undermines trust and exposes the district to legal risk. Selective enforcement sends a dangerous message that policy applies only when it is easy. Consistency is what gives policy credibility. And policy without oversight. Finally, boards sometimes adopt policy and assume the work is done. But policy without monitoring is simply words on paper. For example, if a board adopts a fiscal oversight policy requiring regular financial reporting, but never reviews the reports carefully or asks follow-up questions, the accountability mechanism fails. Policy must be paired with reporting expectations, data review, and superintendent evaluation alignment. Otherwise, policy becomes symbolic. High-functioning boards understand that policy governance rarely fails dramatically. It fails quietly through small boundary crossings, exceptions, and lack of follow-through. Avoiding these pitfalls requires discipline, reflection, and a consistent commitment to governing through policy. Policy reminds us that school boards lead not by managing the system, but by setting its direction. Through clear, aligned, and disciplined policy governance, boards create stability, clarity, and accountability that ultimately support student success. Effective boards don't just pass policies, they govern through them.